Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, Changing America. I'm Carlos Correa. On the program, Anthony Mora, an assistant professor of Latina and Latino Studies, American Culture and History at the University of Michigan. We'll talk to him about immigration issues and his recent book, Border Dilemmas. But first, an area organization along the United States and Mexican border is giving back despite all the violence. Volunteers come together regularly to build hundreds of homes free of charge to families in need living in Ciudad Juarez. There is a long list of families waiting to hear from David Robertson, the executive director of Casa por Cristo.
When you've built almost 3,800 homes in a community, the community knows you.
For close to 20 years, Robertson and volunteers from his organization have gathered and traveled across the border, building 1 to 2 bedroom homes.
This is something that was totally beyond anything they could ever hope or dream for. This is something that they couldn't have ever done themselves. And for you to come in and say, here's a house, bam, it's not going to rain in here, the wind's not going to blow through, you're going to be cool in the summer, you're going to be warm in the winter. That was life-changing for them.
The group teams up with churches in Mexico where pastors help find families in need of shelter.
The reason we have the local pastors do it is because if I walk over there, I'm going to want to build a house for everybody. It's just all going to be overwhelming to me. And so we do it through the local pastors because they're the ones living in the community.
Once the family is identified, they go through an application process, and then workers with Casa por Cristo find teams all over the United States to sponsor and build the home.
There's a benefit for our families that we're building for, obviously, but also the benefit for our teams that are coming down. To be empowered to gain a larger worldview, a bigger perspective.
Jorge Alvarez is just one of the many volunteers helping build homes.
Now when I have a problem, if I think, oh, well, I'm not driving the car that I always wanted, I think I have a car. When I complain that, a pipe burst in my house, I think I have a house that has plumbing inside of it.
Alvarez admits he wasn't too sure about crossing the border, especially during these times where drug violence in Ciudad Juarez has quickly made it one of the most dangerous places in the world.
There's murders everywhere. Evil and hate is going to be found everywhere. But the need is there despite it, whether we're going to have a peaceful border or not, whether we have good trade policies or not, whether the drug demand goes up or down, the need is there.
Alvarez says he wishes he had a come-to-Jesus realization for volunteering with Casa por Cristo, but it was more shame that drove him to help.
They're not any different than you are. They might be in a different country, they might be in a different economic situation, but the kids are enjoying themselves the way that we enjoy ourselves. The families needs to eat just like we'd like to eat, So when I go out there, at first I thought it was going to be something, where I'm helping them, and now I come back from building, and all I can realize, or all I think about, is what they gave to me.
Volunteers with the group have built close to 4,000 homes, but annual construction has slowed since the violence began.
Is anything with MX at the end of it, people are afraid to go to right now. The violence has affected our teams coming down to build, but our teams that come, since the violence has started, we've crossed over 12,000 volunteers and not had a single incident. Had no issues with any violence at all.
Leaders with the group have changed some things to help keep volunteers safe. For example, workers are not allowed to visit the downtown area or leave the build site after dark.
So there's been times where they come in and say, you know what, it's not safe to build in my colonia. And so for like 2 years we didn't build in the Felipe Angeles, Siglo XXI, that area right across from UTEP. We didn't build in those areas for about 2.5 years. And we didn't build anything farther down the valley than Loma Blanca because if you really look at the statistics now, the vast majority of the violence is happening down the valley. And so we don't build down there.
The group stopped accepting applications 2 years ago in order to fulfill its mission and build homes to those still on its waiting list. And despite all the dangers, volunteers are still willing to cross over in order to make a difference in someone's life. And immigration continues to be a topic that many people talk about, especially in our neck of the woods. Joining me now is Dr. Anthony Mora, assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and you're also an author. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciate being here.
Great. First, Dr. Mora, why do you think there's so much interest in the United States-Mexican border?
Well, I think that there's always been an interest in the relationship between the United States and Mexico. I think that the two nations have had a long history of admiration for each other. I think of mutual interest in their culture, in how their governments have been organized. I think there's been a long relationship in terms of trade and migration. But I think there's also been a long history of anxieties about those relationships. So the very things that fascinate one nation with the other are also the things that make them very hesitant about their relationship. So I think that the current interest in the U.S.-Mexican border is really part of a long trajectory that we can see back to the 19th century.
Do you think that among people there's a big fear when it comes to immigration? I mean, just saying the word, a lot of people, it triggers a lot of people.
It is a very emotional topic right now in the United States. I think that there is fear out there among some people, but I do think also that most people in the United States want to be fair, that I think that there is an interest in the U.S. in having a just approach to immigration. And I'm hopeful that those voices will win out over perhaps the ones that are right now seeming a little bit more hysterical or overly anxious about it.
Mm-hmm. Where do you see immigration in the coming years? This country was based from immigrants, but as we get new generations, do you think that the immigration will kind of die down? Or, I mean, what do you see the future of immigration?
Well, I think immigration will always occur.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that there's always going to be different groups of people who are interested in moving, sometimes for its own sake. I think there's always been people who like the adventure of moving. I think economics is oftentimes the major motivation for migration, so if people see that they can have a better opportunity in a new place versus another place, they're going to move for those reasons. The future of what immigration will look like for the U.S. isn't maybe totally clear right now. I do think that we're seeing actually a drop-off in migration from Mexico. Part of that has to do with the economy in the U.S. isn't so good. People are motivated to come for jobs. If there aren't jobs, they're not going to come. And there's also changing circumstances in Mexico as the birth rate is lowered. This has maybe reduced the demand for migration or the need to migrate. So it's interesting that migration is at a real low period right now, despite the anxiety that the U.S. is having about it.
Now, Dr. Mora, you recently published a book. When the U.S.-Mexican War ended back in 1848, Mexicans living in the conquered territory were given a choice to either stay here or move down south. Based on the research that you did for this book, how do you think that impacted both Mexicans and Americans?
Well, most Mexicans who were living in the ceded territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Alta California did decide to actually stay in the United States. So a majority of the Mexican people who were in those areas did remain and created a life for themselves here. And New Mexico had the largest number of Mexicans. And really the shape and texture of New Mexico today is very much a product of their efforts and the way they came to understand their role within the United States. But there was a significant number of people who also chose to leave or tried to leave the United States and founded the town of La Mesilla right after the war and created a community which they believed was a patriotic Mexican national community. But much to their chagrin, the border happened to shift on them again after all, and so they ended up being part of the United States too. So really that's the story, that's where the book story begins, thinking of how these two towns have this complicated relationship with the United States, with Mexico, with nationalism, and racial identity.
What kind of Or what sparked your interest in this topic for this book?
Well, I think that New Mexico hasn't had a lot of research done on the 19th century. I think that the period of transition from Mexico to the U.S. has been a neglected one by historians, even within the United States. And I think southern New Mexico has also been an area that really hasn't gotten a lot of attention, despite being a very dynamic area, despite having these really interesting stories of competing ideas about life in the U.S. And so all of those things are things that motivated me to want to tell those stories and to bring them to light.
Great. And do you think that back then Mexicans were thinking ahead when they were making their choice in terms of the future of what this land would become?
Well, they were thinking about their future. I don't think they were very good predictors of the future, or they necessarily knew how things were going to play out. But definitely I think that their decisions were motivated by what they imagined possibilities to be, and I think that there was, on both sides of the border, a lot of anxiety about what life in the U.S. might have meant. So those who left the United States, I think, felt more anxious that they would not have an equal place in the U.S., or were concerned about the way in which the U.S.-Mexican War had been fought and precipitated. The people who stayed in the U.S., I think, were also cautious, but probably a little bit more optimistic. I think that they thought that there were opportunities to be had in the U.S., but I don't think either side really predicted how things would ultimately play out.
Now, in any culture, family is really important, especially for Hispanics. Do you think that played a role in how they would ultimately make the decision whether to stay here or move down south?
Well, I think family networks were definitely in the mix of how people decided to organize their lives. I think that we also see that at times families were divided about what the best solution was going to be in terms of staying within the U.S. or moving back to Mexico. There are certainly stories of people visiting their family and having a lot of tension between Mesilla and Las Cruces, one being on the Mexican side and one being on the U.S. side. So family was part of it, for sure.
Do you think the families were torn apart? Part of the family staying here and the other half going down to Mexico? Or?
I don't think it was necessarily as dramatic as that. I think that, or at least I didn't see any evidence of families sort of ripped apart like that. But I mean, I would say there was probably tensions and heated arguments probably around the dinner table, if you were, or so to say. But I don't know about necessarily cases where they just didn't speak to each other ever again.
So you're from here, from New Mexico.
I am, yes.
So tell me a little bit about the way you did your research. Did you interview people? Did you go and looked up books in libraries?
Well, I did mostly archival research, so I didn't do, since I was interested in this in the 19th century period, I tried to find as many sources from the period as I could, which included things like the records of the diocese, records from military sources and newspapers, personal letters that have been preserved in archives from the time period, business records in some cases. So really what I could find, I tried to make use of.
Mm-hmm. And what has been the reaction so far from those who have picked up the book or who have you shared this knowledge with?
Well, luckily, I feel people have been very positive about the book. I think no matter where one sort of falls in terms of contemporary debates, you can't deny it's a really compelling story to have these towns so close to each other and yet so divided. The sort of twists and turns of historical irony and the shifting border and how it sort of upended certain people's lives and changed other people's lives for the better is one which I think appeals to people in a certain sort of way and hopefully captures their imagination.
How do you think that the group who decided to move down south, how do you think they treated the ones that decided to stay here?
Well, there was a lot of suspicion on the part of the people in Mesilla who had moved to Mexico, what they had hoped would continue to be Mexico, and the people in Las Cruces, the Mexicans who had decided to be part of the United States. From their perspective, they saw the people who remained in the U.S. as being traitorous, right, as having betrayed the Mexican nation. In many ways, they argued that they had forfeited their Mexican identity, that they were no longer really Mexican, that they were Americans. And so there was a great deal of trepidation and suspicion generated towards those who remained behind.
I would imagine they would be thinking you're turning back on your culture and your people.
Absolutely. And I think probably some of them questioned whether it was a wise decision, whether there was going to be equal rights for Mexicans in the U.S. And that was certainly an anxiety for the people who did remain in the U.S. and a long fight to get full citizenship rights. Even though they had been guaranteed citizenship under the Treaty of Hidalgo, they weren't necessarily always given equal access to things.
Do you think those people that stayed expected that big obstacle?
I think that it was something that they discussed. I don't know if they necessarily knew it would be as long of a fight as it has turned out to be. I think that they were probably optimistic that things would change rapidly in their favor. That didn't quite work out. But I do think that they had faith in the future for the U.S., and I think they had faith in what had been guaranteed in the Treaty of Hidalgo.
Do you think there was any resistance from those who settled here?
Resistance to?
In terms resistance from the other side.
From the Mexican side?
Yes.
Or, there was a lot of concern in the Mexican side about actually really propping up the border. So this is sort of one of these historic ironies, right? So the Mexican side, at least initially after the war, really wanted to make sure the border had meaning and really wanted to make sure that Mesilla acted as a buffer to keep the U.S. out, basically. So kind of a reversal of what we think of today. So that was definitely on the plate.
Now, many of us learn or probably think it's quite difficult when we move to different places, perhaps a new school, and we have to learn how to adapt to that. How do you think that the people that stayed here, how did they adapt to living here in America?
Well, what's interesting about their case is that they actually didn't move anywhere, right? So what happened to them is that the meaning of where they were living actually changed over time. So they had to deal with, not going to a new place, but having the place where they were already living suddenly change underneath them. And in the case of Las Cruces, it was reorganized by the U.S. military. Things were renamed. So streets that had been named in Spanish are suddenly named in English. And that was probably quite jarring to them in many ways. But they did continue to advocate both in Las Cruces and throughout New Mexico for the cultural practices that they thought were really important to preserve. Spanish language they advocated quite hard for in the 19th century, even though in much of the U.S. there was a lot of hostility towards that. Religious practices they also were very keen on maintaining. So I think that they adapted and they were able to negotiate between participating in the U.S., but also doing so under the terms that they thought worked best for them.
What are some of the struggles you think that still exist today, if any?
Well, I think that there is still a lot of uncertainty about what the U.S. is going to be as a multicultural nation. I think that the debates that are happening in the 19th century about the future of New Mexico and its very large Mexican or Hispanic population are quite comparable to the debates that are going on today about recent Mexican migrants in terms of language, basic rights, participation in the national government. I think that there's more that we need to discuss as a nation about these issues and what role we want to play with our neighboring nation of Mexico as well.
Why do you think it's important for this culture to kind of keep their traditions alive, especially when their land was changed right in front of them?
Well, I think they're not unique in that. I think that that's something that a lot of societies go through. Certainly the larger U.S. has things that it's committed to, that it imagines as fundamental to its identity, and so I don't think they were unusual in that way. I think that they were choosing things that were, in some instances provided comfort for them. I think in some instances it was about traditions, handing down things through generations. It was about their identity, how they imagined themselves to be within the U.S. as unique, as something that they didn't want to sacrifice in their participation. I think all of those things played into it.
Is there a fear, do you think, among at that time, the Anglos, who thought, you know, the people that decided to stay here, would they make this new country, quote unquote, new country, into what Mexico is or was?
There was a lot of anxiety among many Euro-Americans or Anglo-Americans about incorporating such a large Mexican population into the U.S. And you know, this is really the first time that there is this substantial number who come into the U.S. as citizens. And there's quite a bit of debate in Congress about what this means. There's quite a bit of debate in the public press at the time about what it means and what role they're going to have. And I think that you know, those anxieties play out in real political terms. So New Mexico is kept a territory quite a long time, 1848 more or less to 1912, in which they don't have a voting member in Congress. They're not participating in national elections. The governor is appointed for them. They don't get to elect the governor. And all of these things, I think, are ramifications about those anxieties that played out among many Euro-Americans, many Anglos at the time. Not all of them, but many of them.
What do you think about the number of Hispanics growing here in this country?
Well, I think it's only to the good. I think that anytime, you know, one adds more diversity, more points of view, I think that's only enriching the country. Whatever the case may be, it's a reality that the U.S. has to come to terms with. Certainly, we see 1 in 5 school children today is Hispanic in the United States. Most of the nation's recent population growth has been Hispanic. So I think that the U.S. is in a new era in terms of what its identity will look like, and that doesn't mean things will be lost from previous, you know, the good things will remain as they always have, but it means, you know, there will be new things that come into the U.S. as well.
Now, you mentioned there was a divide between the two towns. Why do you think that was, and do you think there's a divide now?
Well, it's the question for now is one that I often ask when I've come back here, because I've always been curious about how much this historical tension has persisted. And I do think there does continue to be tensions between Mesilla and Las Cruces, although I don't think they're under the national lines that they were in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, it was really about one's allegiance to Mexico versus one's allegiance to the United States, and was very much tied to how they were thinking about Mexican national identity. That is not so much the case anymore, but I think we do see, you know, economic tensions between Las Cruces and Mesilla. I think that there's tensions around tourism, the desire certainly to turn or to cultivate tourism in southern New Mexico, Mesilla being a prime destination where Mesilleros are not always quite so excited about that, is a lingering tension that exists that is certainly not a direct translation from the 19th century, but perhaps has some of its roots there.
So you live where I grew up in the Midwest, and you have a new study that you're working on that explores the relationship between African Americans and Mexican Americans in the early 20th century in the Midwest. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I'm really interested in these questions about how different groups within the U.S. got along with each other or came to understand each other. And quite often historians have really tended to focus on, say, Anglos and Mexicans or African Americans and whites, but haven't thought a lot about how these groups thought about each other, right? Without necessarily involving Anglos or whites in the story. And I was also interested in the coverage that was around migration, Mexican migration in particular, to places like South Carolina recently that sort of posited the idea that Mexicans and African Americans really hadn't encountered each other before, which actually, as a historian, I wanted to challenge because they had actually encountered each other quite often, and in the Midwest in particular, there's a lot of interaction and a lot of discussion about what their relationship might be to each other.
And so when do you think that your research would be concluded, or is this kind of an ongoing project for you?
Right now it's an early stage of the project, so in terms of another book, probably several years away. I'm just starting out on it, but I hope it develops smoothly and quickly.
So a lot of hard work ahead for you.
Yes, a lot of time in Chicago, your hometown.
Exactly. In terms of your book that you recently published, where can people find that, pick that up, and learn more about it?
Well, they can certainly go to Duke University Press's webpage. Duke University Press is who published the book. They can also find it on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. It's also in paperback. It's also available as an e-book for the Nook or the Kindle, so they can download it that way as well.
Were there any challenges did you face doing your research for this first book?
I think the challenge was that I wanted to tell the story of these two towns in a way that I hope that the historical actors would have seen as fair, as representing each side equitably and their motivations as best that I could, and I hope I accomplished that.
I'm sure you'll get a lot of positive feedback, but are you concerned that you might get maybe some negative feedback about this book?
I don't think so. I mean, I hope not. I think that it's a story that's really captivating in terms of, you know, wherever your political allegiances today may be. It's a story that's really quite fascinating. How these different groups of people dealt with the idea that they suddenly were in a different nation, right? That the land that they had been living on was different through no actions of their own, really, but through diplomatic changes, right, that are happening well beyond where they're living themselves. And so, you know, I'm not really anticipating any negative reaction. I think that people will find the story appealing and interesting and come to it in those terms.
And I'm sure you do a lot of sharing with your classes at the University of Michigan. Dr. Anthony Mora, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. Remember, you can see this entire interview online at krwg.org. While you're there, you can visit our blog, or you can follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook. I'm Carlos Correa. Until next time.